Welcome back to Slice of News, where I cut you off a slice of news. Day 2 of Government Shutdown 2025. In the lead up to this government shutdown, Republicans would yell to anyone who would listen. Democrats wanted to give health care to those illegals. And as a result, the Republicans would stand firm and not give in to their demands, and the government would have to be shut down. Unsurprisingly, that claim is inaccurate. While it is true that the hill the Democrats decided to stand their ground upon was healthcare related, it was not about funding healthcare for illegals. Democrats were very clear. What this came down to was undoing the $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts that the Republicans enacted in their big, beautiful bill and extending subsidies for the middle class Americans that buy health insurance off the Affordable Care Act marketplace. Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries was quoted as saying, "In an environment where the cost of living is already too high, our position is a simple one. Cancel the cuts, lower the costs, save health care. We're willing and able to find a bipartisan path forward to fund the government in a way that actually meets the needs of the American people in terms of their health, their safety, and their economic well-being." And it is in that demand to keep the subsidies and reverse the cuts to Medicaid that the impasse between the Republicans and the Democratic leadership was cemented. Republican lawmakers signaled that they were open to negotiating on an extension to the subsidies, but not in a part of a broader funding battle. And while they didn't outright say it, they were definitely not going to budge on the Medicaid cuts, mostly because it was those exact cuts that they used to pay part of the $4 trillion in tax cuts in their big, beautiful bill. So reversing those cuts was a no-go for them, mostly because they had obviously used that money for what they thought was more important things, like giving tax cuts to rich people. But because Democrats stood on canceling those cuts, Republicans used that to claim that they wanted to give undocumented immigrants health care. One of the Republican Party's favorite scare tactics is to blame the evil illegals for either taking something away from the good, honest Americans or getting something that they don't deserve. Vice President J.D. Vance came out and said a lot of emergency health care at hospitals that are provided to illegal aliens that was funded by the federal government, we turned off that funding because, of course, we want American citizens to benefit from those hospital services, not to be taxed and then have those hospital services go to illegal aliens. The problem with this claim, of course, is that undocumented immigrants are not eligible for Medicaid. So reversing Medicaid cuts has nothing to do with health care for undocumented immigrants. What the law did was actually reduce funding for so-called emergency Medicaid, which is what reimburses hospitals for emergency services for patients who would otherwise be eligible for Medicaid but aren't because of their immigration status, whether they're undocumented or parole status, are here legally but on a temporary basis, or if they're legally but on a 5-year waiting period. And of course, it did not eliminate federal funding for emergency Medicaid. It just reduced those funds. But of course, we took away the money those dastardly Democrats are trying to use for those illegals. Plays a lot better with their base than the reality that they just reduce the amount of funding hospitals get reimbursed for in the cases where the so-called emergency Medicaid is used. As Vice President Vance may or may not know, the law requires hospitals provide access to emergency services regardless of the patient's ability to pay or their immigration status. It really presents a chilling insight into the Republican mindset when they've reframed anyone who needs emergency medical care can receive it regardless of status into illegals are using up our American hospitals and taking away medical care from real Americans. What he's kind of saying without outright saying is that in their mind, medical care is something that should be reserved for those who are worthy of it, and undocumented immigrants don't deserve it because they're not Americans. But it speaks to the deep-seated conservative fear that somewhere, someone undeserving is receiving something that they don't deserve. Here, it's medical care for undocumented immigrants. It's why they demonize welfare and food benefits for those suffering through food insecurity. In a nation of plenty, one of the worst things that could happen in their mind is someone who they see as unworthy receiving some of it. Vance went on to say that President Trump and congressional Republicans turned off that money to healthcare funding for illegal aliens, when what they actually did was take healthcare away from legal immigrants, people who were on work visas, which reduces the number of lawful immigrants' insurance coverage by 1.4 million, according to the Congressional Budget Office. And while the CBO can't give exact numbers on how much of the $19 billion spent on emergency Medicaid between the years of 2017 and 2023 went to care of, quote, illegals, it only amounted to 1% of the total Medicaid spending during that time period. So the idea that a bunch of money is being spent on medical care for illegals is patently false. Instead of ensuring that illegals aren't using up our precious emergency medical services in America's emergency rooms, their big, beautiful bill has really done has exploded the amount of uninsured Americans in this country by 10 million. There's definitely a healthcare crisis in this country, but it's not because of illegals. It's because after the premium tax credits expire at the end of the year, 22 million more people are going to be left without insurance. And their medical needs don't go away just because their medical insurance does. And I'm going to go out on a limb and probably guess that those tens of millions of future uninsured people are not all Democrats. So to distract their base from the fact they're about to lose their own health insurance, they say, oh, look, illegals, they're taking your medical care, and they don't deserve it. This idea that medical care should only be for the worthy and those with the funds to pay for it is one that is deeply troubling. Medical care should be for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or a card-carrying American or just in America. Everyone has needs, emergency medical needs, and they should be able to receive it regardless of financial status or immigration status. Everyone deserves quality medical care, no matter who they are, should be a universal belief, but they've turned it into this liberal talking point that they can say, not everyone, only the people that we think are worth it. Somewhere along the line, empathy and basic humanity became some sort of liberal weakness. Caring about people outside your immediate community became something that painted you as soft and weak. And I think deriding those traits says far more about them than it says about their so-called liberal enemies. Trying to push this narrative that the Democratic lawmakers just wanted to give illegals medical care intentionally distracts from the fact that pushing to reverse those Medicaid cuts and to keep the Affordable Care Act subsidies was in reality a fight to protect all Americans, red or blue, and that was something worth standing up for and shutting the government down over. Even though it should not have come to that, this was never about undocumented immigrants. It was about the Republican Party putting tax cuts and the needs of corporations above the needs of their own people and hoping that their voters never realize that that's what they're doing. The Democrats were out there trying to keep Medicaid and Affordable Care Act subsidies for all Americans, while the Republicans were just out there taking healthcare away from Americans. We are in a Republican government shutdown. The government didn't shut down because Democrats wouldn't budge on giving illegals healthcare. As Democratic House Leader Hakeem Jeffries said, Donald Trump and the Republicans have shut down the government because they do not want to provide health care to working-class Americans. Federal law prohibits the use of Medicare, Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and the Affordable Care Act to provide health insurance in any way, shape, or form to undocumented immigrants. Period. Full stop. That is the law, and Democrats aren't trying to change that. And really, what more can you say? That perfectly sums up the reality of the situation. So any claim to the contrary is completely false. The government shutdown that we find ourselves in today is entirely due to Republican lawmakers' refusal to reverse course on their cuts to Medicaid and to retain the Affordable Care Act subsidies. Republican lawmakers wanted to hurt working-class Americans, red and blue, Democrat and Republican, but blame the Democratic lawmakers and blame illegals when the fault lies entirely on them. I do not know how long this shutdown will last, but when it is eventually over, I hope everyone remembers who really is to blame for it in the first place. And it's not the Democrats, and it's not the illegals. It is squarely on the Republican leadership, from the top down, president, vice president, and all the Republicans in Congress. And I hope someday soon, the idea of compassion and desire to help your fellow man stops being seen as a liberal weakness and goes back to being an American value. Alright guys, that's going to be it for this episode of A Slice of News. As always, I've been your host, Mr. Slice, and until next time, when I cut you off, another slice of news.